Welcome to African Development Podcast, your go-to source for premium conversations on various aspects of Africa's development, from peace and security to trade, migration, climate change, and innovation.
I am Professor Tim Murithi, Head of Peacebuilding Interventions Program at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation.
Interesting. You have been part of the two-day United Nations Civil Society Conference for 2024, the 69th one and the first one to happen in the Global South, in Africa, to be precise. What do you make, of the conversations that you have had, in the course of the last 2 days?
Yes, the conversations have been very fruitful. I would say they've been quite dynamic, very frank at times. This is a gathering of civil society actors from all across the world, all continents. We are the embodiment of global civil society, and it is the tradition of civil society to speak out on issues and to be quite frank and to be very truthful. So I think you heard some very strong statements coming out through the two-day conference, and some very important issues were put on the table relating to the state of global governance, the state of human rights, the state of gender equality, issues around climate change and the environment, and quite a number of issues that are affecting all of us as people, living in our own contexts around the world. So I think the conversations were very robust and very strong, and I would say this is much more truthful even than what you occasionally hear in diplomatic gatherings. So in that sense, I think it was a very, very constructive and productive and fruitful two-day conference of United Nations and civil society actors.
You're part of many African civil society networks pushing for these reforms, the reforms of the global multilateral system, be it in the area of finance, be it in the area of human rights, be it in the area of peace and security. What is for you, as Africa, groups of civil societies, here in this conference? What is your important takeaway? And how do you hope to take advantage of the conversation that has started in Nairobi to push forward with these reforms that, you have been advocating for some time?
Yeah, this is the United Nations Civil Society Conference that is feeding into the United Nations Summit of the Future, in which a document known as the Pact of the Future has been developed, which will frame global governance and issues relating to the well-being of people for the next, hopefully, 5 to 10 years. So from our perspectives, the specific team that I was working with at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation and Oxfam International, we were the co-conveners of an what was so-called Impact Coalition that focused on United Nations Charter reform. So reform of the United Nations Charter, as you know, it was adopted in 1945 in June. And at that stage, 51 countries were present. Yeah. Only 3 African countries were present. Egypt, Ethiopia, Liberia, and South Africa was still under the brutal yoke of apartheid. White supremacist apartheid. So from an African perspective, the whole issue of the reform of the United Nations Charter to be more inclusive of those who were not there at the outset is extremely important. And the Impact Coalition we convened came to a number of key findings, notably, firstly, that the case for United Nations Charter reform is very, very strong. In fact, there is an Article 109, paragraph 3, that is very specific about the need for this charter to be reviewed 10 years after the establishment of the United Nations. So if it was established in 1945, then the review should have happened in 1955. It didn't happen. And so countries from the global south are now agitating, and Africa as a continent is also agitating for the reform of the United Nations Charter in a manner that will be more inclusive, but also reflective and fit for purpose in terms of multilateralism and international relations in the 21st century. So that relates beyond collective security and a global system of collective security to also the form of the global financial architecture and issues, and a much more serious and focused approach to dealing with climate emergency, which, as we can see here, we are at the moment in Nairobi, Kenya, which has been recently devastated by a number of very devastating floods with more than 200 people killed. So climate change is real, and these are some of the issues that emerge from the discussions. And in terms of the way forward, these coalitions, including the Impact Coalition that we established, which is now called the United Nations Charter Reform Coalition, will work on pushing forward the agenda.
In terms, to be specific, the African civil society groups, that are involved in these efforts to reform the whole multilateral. What are your specific asks, as a continent, as Africa? What is the common African position on these issues, either be it in relation to human rights, be it in relation to peace and security, because we have so many conflicts in Africa that we know are not just purely African conflicts, in the sense that, there's involvement of external forces and powers in it, and also the reform of the international, financial architecture. So what are your specific asks in terms of reform of this system, the global multilateral system?
The United Nations Security Council plays a significant role on the African continent. About 60% of the agenda of the UN Security Council focuses on crisis situations across the African continent. And as you stated, we have crisis in the Sahel, we have crisis in Somalia, in Mozambique. Sudan now is in a major situation. All of these issues require effective institutions of multilateralism to actually address. So our specific ask on Security Council reform is that African countries be included as part of the permanent 5 members of the Security Council. In the absence of that, then we have to find a system that works without the veto. And so we're calling also for the elimination of the veto, because we feel it's often used very, indiscriminately and unfairly, and to the privilege of certain actors at the expense of others. So that's a very specific ask. In the absence of any progress, we've called for the Charter reform, the United Nations reform, Charter reform, to focus on the UN Security Council, the transformation of the UN Security Council. So that is a very specific request. In terms of the global financial architecture, as you know, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and WTO are at the moment not inclusive in terms of their voting, the approach to voting and decision making. And again, Africa is almost a spectator sitting on the outside looking in at some of these very important decisions that affect the livelihoods of African communities and the ability of African communities to, in fact, provide adequate services and resource and provisions for their own people to live healthy life. And debt, for example, is a major issue that needs to be looked at in terms of the IMF and the World Bank. And so there's call for debt restructuring, but also there's call for, as far as climate change is concerned, the resources to address the loss and damage that has occurred to African countries due to climate change, the devastating effects of climate change, which includes, quite a substantial fund which is required to support countries in Africa and across the global south to address the issues that they have going forward. And then a number of issues around upholding the principles and norms that we've adopted on gender equality across the board and the different spheres of work that we do, and also strengthening human rights defense across the African continent, where in some of our countries, our human rights defenders' lives are at risk. And so we have to push at the multilateral level, at the international and the continental level of the African Union to also advance the safety of human rights defenders.
Interesting. Finally, what are the next steps for you beyond Nairobi, as we move towards the Summit of the Future in September? From an African perspective, what do you want to do in terms of consolidating your position and ensuring that they reflect, in the outcome of the Summit of the Future?
Yes, indeed. And between now and September 19, 2021, when the so-called action days at the Summit of the Future will take place, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. The coalitions that we've established are not going to simply run themselves. We have to put in the hard work of strengthening the coalition and network partners, ensuring everybody's on board, and then comes the difficult work of engaging United Nations General Assembly member states, who are the ultimate arbiters and deciders of what goes into the Pact of the Future that will frame the future of global governance and the way the world runs for the next 5 to 10 years. So it's going to be laborious work of strategizing, raising the necessary resources and planning to engage key actors, including member states, governments themselves directly, intergovernmental organizations like the African Union, ECOWAS, IGAD, SADC, and also private sector actors, unions, other civil society formations, and the youth, who we should not exclude, because they are the ones who are ultimately going to drive this agenda going forward. And so there is a lot of groundwork that needs to be done, a lot of planning that needs to be done, a lot of implementation, follow through. And so, in fact, we have a very tight schedule because the time is short from an African perspective to get us to the Summit of the Future, which is in less than 4 or 5 months' time. So yeah, that I would say is what we have on our plate and what we have to drive going forward.
Thank you for listening to African Development Podcast. We hope you found it enlightening and informative. Keep a tab on our social media pages for more exciting episodes.